Welcome to Revolution and Ideology. I am Nick,
I'm Jared.
and in this episode, we are discussing a study that was done related to gaming, actually, and apocalyptic behavior. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but, anyways, Jared and I have done a series of episodes on the apocalypse in film, and we're both really interested in gaming. Strangely, I guess, not that those two things kind of go together, but we did an episode actually on DayZ, which is an apocalyptic game that we're both obsessed with, talking about whether or not it's a good model for the apocalypse. So we were kind of interested in this study. These researchers did a study of gaming behavior in a closed beta test, suggesting that that would be a good model for the apocalypse, which we'll get into the details of how they did it and what that means and whether or not we agree. But just a little bit about this study. It was, I guess it wasn't actually published. It was presented at a conference in 2017. I have the name here. It was presented at the 26th International Conference on the World Wide Web in 2017. It's titled, "I Would Not Plant Apple Trees If the World Will Be Wiped," analyzing hundreds of millions of behavioral records of players during an MMORPG beta test. I hate everything about that title, but that's fine. Um, Thoughts before we get started?
No, I mean, I'm interested to get started. I mean, we definitely did the episode on Daisy. It's pretty much the only game that I play, and it. I don't. I mean, I know you
Mhm,
play a handful or whatever, and things along those lines. So I don't like. And that game is designed to be apocalyptic, and
mhm,
as somewhat of a social experiment, people think it's a zombie game. It's actually really not. It's more about the interaction with people and how they would act with limited resources and in tense situations and things along those lines.
mhm,
Um, it does sound, at least from what you've described to me, that what was used in this article is not along the same lines. So I'm interested
mhm.
to see what they find. And then, of course, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical right off the bat because, again, gaming culture in and of itself, I don't know presents the best model. But let's see
Yeah,
what they found.
exactly. So let's talk about a little bit about the methodology, and then we'll talk about the findings. So there was a game, if you're not familiar, called, I mean, it still exists, called Archeage. And it's a, MMO, just like World of Warcraft type style of game. And they were running a closed beta test before the game launched. I actually don't know when the beta test was. This presentation was presented in 2017, but I think the game launched in like 2013 or 2014. So the beta test would have been then. So the researchers hypothesized that, oh, by the way, during the beta test, I don't remember how long it was, 6 weeks or something. We'll see in a second. At the end of it, the world was going to be wiped. So anything, any progressions you did on your players, etc., was you're not going to get to keep that. That wasn't persistent. So they hypothesized that this beta test actually would be a good test for apocalyptic behavior because at the end of this test, essentially the world was going to end, right? So the beta test is kind of like an apocalyptic scenario, and so what they wanted to analyze was if people's behaviors changed as they got closer to quote unquote the end of the world, right? To the end of the beta test. Did they become more violent? Did they all kinds of stuff, right? Did they work on the progression of their player and crafting items and so forth? So they got the full record of all player behaviors from the developer of the game. And there were 81,000 players that they analyzed, 275 million records. So this is like, interactions between players or, spending the virtual currency, crafting an item, killing another player, all this kind of stuff. So they have everything that any player did in the game this entire time. So there's 275 million records of different behaviors. And so they analyzed all of those to see sort of what happened during the course of the beta test. Thoughts on this so far?
No, I mean, it all sounds good. I do think, like I said, it's not necessarily a game that's set in the apocalypse. So that's not necessarily the equation. What they're insinuating, I guess, for lay people out there, when Nick says wipe, essentially, like, there's this whole world built, and excuse me, players have been interacting and doing things and building things and crafting things for, I don't know how long the beta test was, but let's say days, weeks, months, whatever. And they've built this entire world and community and things along those lines. And essentially a wipe means that all of that goes away. Like, this world will cease to exist for these players. And that's what they're looking at. So when the game comes out after this beta test, then it starts fresh and new. But the players, in their mind, everything they've done to this point is going to go away. So that's what they're insinuating is the gaming world apocalypse for this specific game. So
it was 11 weeks, just so we know. I just looked on the article. Okay, so let's see what they found, I guess, before we start giving our opinions of everything. But Jared's point is, we'll talk about that when we get there. So what did they find? First, they analyzed it from two different approaches. Basically, system-wide and individual, so from a macro and a micro scale. So they analyzed the players of each individual to see if a particular individual changed their behavior through the course of the beta test. Then they did the generalization, right? Looking at all of the data together, was there an average of change of the behavior as an aggregate, like all of the players together, right? So let's talk about what they found. I'll just read some quotes here that will give us an idea. Some outliers resorted to antisocial behavior, such as murder. And this game has an interesting dynamic where if you kill, there's races, apparently, different classes of characters in the game. And if you kill someone that is of your same class / race, then that is considered a murder as far as the game is concerned. And there's different consequences for that in really simple terms. So they classified all those behaviors as murder. And they found that there were some individuals that did increase their murder rate towards the end of the beta, but they did not find that as an aggregate, there was an increase in the average of number of murders throughout the beta test as it got closer to the end, which is kind of interesting. I think if I remember correctly, of all of the behaviors towards the end of the game, there were only 334 murders, which out of 81,000 players is like outrageous, right? Now, clearly all those players weren't playing all the time, but so yeah, they said basically no, that there were a few outliers, but overall, that wasn't a trend, which I found interesting. I definitely thought people would just start, killing willy-nilly when the game was about to be wiped, but that didn't happen. Then they analyzed chats also between players within the game, which is interesting. They say we surprisingly find that chat content exhibits a slightly positive trend as the closed beta test draws to a close. Overall, players increase social interactions with others. They exchange more in-game messages and create more parties to enjoy group play or compete high-level quests. So they analyzed the chat sentiment and the number of chats in the game and actually found that chat sentiment overall on average increased, became more towards the happy side of the scale as the closed beta test reached its end, which is kind of interesting. And that there were more social behaviors. So people were more likely to get together and play in groups as the beta test was coming to an end, which is also kind of interesting. They also analyzed people that left the game early versus that stuck it out to the end. So, right, you sign up for the 11-week beta, but you left at week 6, right, or week 9 or whatever, versus playing like at least all the way, close to the end. They categorized the ones that left early. They called them churners. And actually, they found that these churners were the ones that were displaying most of the antisocial behavior. So the ones that were murdering, etc. That kind of makes sense because that's an indication that they don't have as much investment, right? They're not as loyal, I guess, to sort of the game world, we might say, which is kind of interesting. But they said, contrary to the reassuring adage that is, even if I knew the world would go to pieces tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree, i.e., I would still continue to better myself and the world, players abandoned character progression, showing a drastic decrease in quest completion, leveling, and ability changes. This finding itself is interesting and indicates why the quote resonates, and at the same time, it sheds light on game design implications for closed beta tests with respect to player reactions to the inevitable end of the beta test. So basically, I don't think this was really surprising at all. As the beta test was nearing its end, people stopped working on progression and the completion of quests, right? Like, why why would you continue to level up your player and build more things, etc., if you know it's all going to be wiped in the next day or two or week or whatever, right? I don't think that was really a surprise. The interesting thing is they said, to the best of their knowledge, they're the first to perform a large-scale quantitative characterization of behavior changes as the beta test of a game ends. So they're the first ones that ever really did this. They said, hey, maybe we could use a world-wiping beta test as an example to model apocalyptic behavior and perform like a wide-scale quantitative analysis of data of player behavior. They were the first ones that did that. So that's kind of interesting in 2017. So what are your thoughts on the findings? Anything that sort of stands out to you there as, counterintuitive?
I'm not surprised. I guess I would have expected a little bit more murderous, trolly type of behavior
Mm-hmm.
than what they found. So that's kind of nice to see. But I think and this is of course a problem we brought up when we did the DayZ episode, or when we talked about apocalyptic films. So that's our angle here as a historian and a sociologist, is that it's not just to have like a review of games or films or anything along those lines. It's to apply them, in this case more so sociologically obviously than historically, as to what do we learn about the way people interact with each other. And I do think that these games do present a nice little petri dish, in a way, to talk about some of these things, but I'm always going to be a little bit skeptical of the fact that, like, it's still a game and the person interacting with that game knows it's a game. They're not so they're not under any other illusions. This is a game to them. So I do think the
Mm-hmm.
lack of like real stakes, like little legitimate stakes, are always going to make the findings kind of, I don't know, not they're not going to be grounded in anything. Like, people are going to
Yeah,
behave
we can't
differently. And
directly relate, right, the players' behaviors in this game or any game to what would actually happen in real life. Like, we're never going to get there.
exactly, and that's why, even like I said, the lone game that either of us play, DayZ, is a decent social experiment, but never a really good one, because again, like people know, if I do something bad, like, it's just a game, I'm going to turn it off and it'll start all over tomorrow when I turn it back on again, and nothing matters. And that other person on the other end of my poor behavior also probably knows that and isn't going to get too angry. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. I
And
mean, we
and
have
they'll
a
get over.
perfect example, right? Like, I was just playing DayZ before we got on the call, and I had met 3 other people, and we were sort of running together. And we had stopped at a well in this city, in this town, and we were all drinking. And another guy ran up down the street, and he stopped and said hi, and put his arm out, and I pulled out my rifle and shot him dead. Right? Like, would I do that in real life? Absolutely not. I have to imagine, right? Like, there's no way that
I don't
I
know,
would
man.
just.
You've got that violent side that maybe none of us. Yeah. So, but back to what you asked about the findings. So I think the interesting part is, um, I did think there'd be a little bit more violence because of gaming culture, and the fact that there
Mhm.
wasn't actually says something about the community that they were able to build over those 11 weeks. The fact that there was
Right.
also the people with even less of a vested stake in the game because they hadn't spent as much time in the community, are the ones that committed most of the atrocities. I think that's also to be expected. If we're talking about like social outliers or social deviants, it's going to be the people that don't feel like they're part of something, right? And
Mhm.
and in a way, maybe we can see that apply a little bit in the real world. Social deviance is attached to people that do feel some sort of disconnected or disassociated, with those around them. So I definitely can see
Mhm.
that. The second part, of course, that wasn't that interesting, but I still want to comment on, is the fact that, yes, towards the end of the wipe cycle, that people stopped planting their apple trees. And I know nothing, I guess, caveat, I know nothing about this game. I've never even heard of this game.
Not me
I've never
either.
seen
Mhm.
footage of it. I've never seen, so I don't know. But if it's a massive multiplayer game, I'm assuming it's a Warcraft style type of thing they
Mhm.
got going on with, I don't know, you said races, so I'm assuming like elves and trolls and all kinds of crap like that. Again, I'm not into those types of games, but regardless, let's let it ride.
We're about to get completely like raided by the Archeage hardcore fans.
I'm sure not a single one of them will watch this video, so that's
No,
fine.
I can't imagine.
I'm not even sure our usual audience will watch this video, since it's a little outside of our wheelhouse. But regardless, back to the moral of the story, the fact that they stopped doing their things towards the end of the wipe. I mean, yes, we could apply that if we all found out tomorrow that there is an asteroid coming or whatever. I mean, I'm sure as crap not going to go sit in a cubicle and fill out
Yeah,
Excel spreadsheets, or like the.
like I'm
So
gonna go lift
yes,
weights or something. Like, that's not gonna happen.
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
like so yes, you're going to stop doing those types of things, and you're going to find something more interesting to do in this last little bit. And I am am happy to see, at least in the findings, that more interesting thing people found to do in their last days, right? Those last
Mhm.
days before their world ended was not necessarily as much murder and pillaging as probably could have happened. So I guess that's kind of nice to see. So I mean those are my takes on that. Again, I'm always going to be super skeptical of any sociological, or even now we're digging further as we get into VR, psychological findings in the game world, because as long as
Mhm.
quote unquote the player knows there is no real stakes to what they're doing, I still don't think it applies. Again, we've seen numerous examples of what people do during apocalyptic like situations in real life for them. Maybe again, the world has not ended recently.
Mhm.
I mean, unless we could get inside the minds of like dinosaur DNA and see what they were thinking. But no, but in all seriousness, but in those types of scenarios, and more times than not, contrary to popular belief, contrary to what people will tell you that play these games, these 7 Days to Die, these Daisies, these Tarkovs, these whatever, people actually don't act like that, don't act
Mhm.
violently and pillagey and murdery and all of those types of things. They're not doing those types of things in the real world, right? Like we see what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and the community came together. Yes, the resources weren't there and the government failed miserably and all of those things, but the people, the individuals that were adversely affected on the ground, they came together, right? They came
Mhm.
together. They were sharing resources. They were rescuing each other. All of the Hurricane Harvey, much the same way in Houston, right? Like we see what happened. Those communities came together. There isn't like some people didn't pull out their, and this is the United States where it could have very well happened. They didn't
Mhm.
pull out their assault rifles and just start like that didn't happen. People were coming together. Going all the way back to one of the examples you did an episode on, I think I was on that one. I helped out a little bit, but the one with the teenage boys that end up stranded on the island, right? Like, and
Mhm.
they don't go all Lord of the Flies on each other. They work together and they create like a place for them to work out, and a place for them to get water, and a place for them to get food. Or one of my favorite examples, way back in the early 1900s, Ernest Shackleton, right, in Antarctica. They get stuck on, I think it's, I don't remember I think it was Georgia. No, they were for Elephant Island. They get stuck on
Mhm.
Elephant Island. And outside of it, yeah, and that community of, and those are rugged sailors, right? Like, and they're not. They were able to come together, right? So those with real life stakes, I think, carry much more weight into what the world looks like as it's ending and how humans would behave. And again, I get it. A couple of hurricanes and being stranded on a couple islands isn't necessarily the apocalypse, but for those individuals living it, it kind of is, right? Like what else?
Mhm.
You're on a stranded island with maybe six, seven other individuals, and none of this information is ever going to get back. You can do whatever you want, and what they chose to do was work together and not, I mean, maybe not plant apple trees, but well, maybe in
Mhm.
some cases, not apple trees in the South Pacific, but yeah.
Mhm.
So I do think trying to draw too many conclusions, even like when we did the Daisy episode from video games, is always going to have its limitations. Not only because the fact that they are not real, but because in these games, because of gamification features to make them more gamey, um, poor behaviors are rewarded in gaming, because I do think it allows people, gaming allows people to have a release or blow off steam or whatever
Mhm.
it is they're trying to do, maybe role play or whatever it is. But some of the mechanics themselves already orient the player towards some of those bad behaviors that they would never do in the real world. Again, using the game that we play, because I know nothing about this other one of the main reasons to travel around the map and interact with these players is to go to military bases. They've made that into the game. They didn't make it
Mhm.
supermarkets. They didn't make it I don't know, botanical gardens. They made it military bases. So so naturally, when you get there and you're surrounded by a bunch of assault rifles and bullets, then again, what else am I going to do while I'm standing
Yeah.
here, right? I'm going to pick this
Mhm.
thing up and I'm going to, like, if my main goal was to go to the botanical gardens and why did I use botanical
I have no
gardens?
idea. That was a really random
Like,
example.
because they're beautiful and they're peaceful, and that's probably why I brought it up. But like,
Maybe
yes,
we should try to grow botanical gardens in
botanical
Daisy and
gardens
see
in
what
some sort of,
happens. Yeah.
maybe there is somebody listening out there that is gaming. I mean, I guess there is. There's like aren't there like zoo simulators? Although zoos is already, I feel very bad about zoos and there being animal
Mhm.
jails, but
You
maybe
need to
there could be
make a
like some sort of,
botanical garden simulator.
Yeah, or a wildlife preserve simulator where it's like, yeah, I think that would
I
be
mean,
that.
there has to be gardening games for sure.
But now I'll go back on what I said for just a second. Maybe there's a reason those games don't exist. Maybe there
Mhm.
is this reason in the human psyche that maybe we do need a little bit of an outlet for more of our unsavory impulses, and maybe that's
Mhm.
what gaming can serve. Maybe people don't want to grow a bunch of crops or take care of animals or whatever, build some sort of community center or something along those lines. Maybe that's why these exist. But again, I don't know. I still think what we can learn about the human condition on a social level during the apocalypse, as this article
Mhm.
tends to insinuate, is going to be inherently limited because of game mechanics.
Though
And
interestingly, when I think about the numbers, I guess I should have looked at this number for real while we were talking, but the 334 murders is what I think the number was. I mean, out of however many millions, hundreds of millions of players' behavior, right, towards the end, and let's say that all 81,000 people were playing, right, even though they weren't at the same time. If there were only 334 people who were just murdering, yeah, it is 334. Yes. Next, we examined how pervasive such antisocial behavior was. We extracted all players that committed at least one murder in the last 2 weeks of the beta period. We note that there were relatively few such murders, 334. So in the last 2 weeks, there were only 334 players that committed a murder. So if I'm looking at real numbers, and let's say, you know, if we were going to apply this to real, how many people, if there actually was an apocalypse, would just be haphazardly murdering people, right? It's very, very, very small number. Despite the fact I know people like to fantasize that it would be like the purge, right? Like that's not, in my opinion, I don't think that's going to happen, right? And there's really no evidence in human history that that would be the case, right? What do you think?
no, I would agree with that. I don't believe, and you know where we come from as a channel that likes to lean into ideologies that are tied to mutual aid and reciprocity and natural law and those types of things that we've talked about when we've gone into things like syndicalism or communalism. Like those are the things that we tend to focus on, again, from more of an academic standpoint. I personally have to have faith in the goodness of the human character to believe in those belief systems, right? Like I am not a person that believes in things like original sin and it's just human nature to be violent and greedy. Like I don't believe that. And again, we've gone through, if somebody wants to argue in the comments, you're going to have to go back through our whole catalog, because all of the evidence there from every historical example I provided is there. It's there. We are not
Mm-hmm.
inherently like that. We've been socialized to be like that, and in this case the video game itself is a socializing agent. Again,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know this specific game, so I really don't want to dig into something I don't know about. But again, in the game, the one game I play, Days, you present me with an assault rifle and a bunch of people shooting at me, then that does change. That's a socializing agent right there,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like so again, that's what we have to go on. But if you put real humans in real situations, the evidence just isn't there, and everyone's going to be like, oh, but what about a historical example X, Y, or Z with like, what would you do with a Hitler, or what would you do with a Genghis Khan, or whatever? Well, in a society that is nearing its end and working together, and you do see somebody like that kind of rise up to prominence, well, those societies know how to deal with that person, and that person would be exiled, right? Like that,
Mm-hmm.
you know how. But in our society, those types of people tend to be celebrated, right? And when I say our types of society, I'm being general, not Eastern or Western. I'm talking about the state, right? The state has structured us into these like,
Mm-hmm.
this type of way of thinking. So again, it's not necessarily cultural or racial. It's based on the idea of state. And again, this is kind of a roundabout way to get me to talk about how political and social and even economic structure socialize us into thinking that it is the that we have to fight and claw and acquire things, and that's it's what we're raised in, and so that's why we believe it. But there is evidence that if you're raised in a very different way, so going back to gaming, if your character is raised in a gaming community that doesn't present those opportunities and doesn't actually reward those opportunities, I think those numbers go even lower, I guess is what I'm saying. So if you do have a botanical garden simulator, I doubt, and maybe they don't even add the mechanic in, but I doubt people are going to run around stabbing each other with like little whatever. I don't know. What do you garden with?
Garden
Garden shears.
shade, yeah.
Yeah, garden shears. So again, like, I mean, it depends on like the environment you're in. And again, any of those people that exhibit those antisocial or deviant or psycho or sociopathic behaviors in those communities are going to be forcefully exiled. And
Mhm.
and and I guess that's what what we saw a little bit in the findings, if we go back to those handful of people that you called, I don't remember what you called them,
Mhm.
churners or turners or
Turners,
something,
yep.
churners. Yeah, I mean, I
Mhm.
guess we see that a little bit, but I don't know. I mean, I
I
come
mean,
back to
even in
the
the game that we play, right? If you are one of those guys that get fully geared and then go to the beach and just kill fresh spawns all day, like people hate that, right? Like you're the worst of the worst. There is no joy in that. And you get quote unquote exiled from the game, right? Like people have no respect for you and don't want to play with you at all, right? So there's even like social pressure in that. It's not even the apocalypse, right? The world isn't ending. It's just not fun for anyone, right?
right, and those game mechanics are a certain way, but yes, the community itself does feel like there is
Mhm.
a way to engage in violence in a way, not in a game that is based on violence. There is
Mhm.
still like a little bit of gatekeeping about when and where that violence should and how it should take place, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting because there's no rules, and yet the community
Mhm.
has decided itself this is the way
Yep.
it should work. So yeah, that's a good example.
Okay, so let's talk about the second thing, which is, we have always operated in the assumption that, with our Daisy video, could we sort of analyze people's behavior in this game that takes place in an apocalyptic setting and get some kind of idea for how people would behave in the real life in an apocalyptic setting, right? I think that's what most people assume. These researchers, instead of that, took a game that was not in an apocalyptic setting, but that because it was a closed beta test where the world would be wiped at the end, it became sort of a model for an apocalypse. What do you think about that? Do you think that one is better than the other? What do you think about the applicability? Not just that this is a video game, we can't apply it to real life, like we know that, but the applicability of this scenario, right? This closed beta with a world wipe at the end.
I don't know if it changed the behavior of the individuals. I mean, it might have, I suppose. Again, I'm going and I'm apologize for anyone that likes this game that I've already forgot Archangels or something. But anyway, like,
Archeage, yeah.
okay, Archangel, whatever. Applying it to what we know is during a wipe, during some of the other games that we have played, that yes, behavior changes a little bit, and yes, maybe you do see people doing a little bit more bandit things or violent things if they know that everything they've worked for the last couple of months is about to be wiped off the face of their virtual earth or things along those lines. But in terms of like determining what behavior would look like, I mean, I guess I'd have to actually know more about the mechanics of that game for me to
Mhm.
have an answer. Like, I mean, is the game inherently violent? Do people go on quests and slay dragons? I don't know the game that well, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I
So
think
do
that
we
would.
think that like the best scenario would be an apocalyptic survival game like DayZ or any of the others you listed that was an apocalyptic setting that also was going through some scenario where things would be wiped, which exists all the time, right? There's all kinds of DayZ servers that wipe every 30 days or whatever. In fact, the server I was just playing on before we got on was a beta test of a new map, right? So at the end of that, it's going to be wiped and no longer exist, right? So would that be a better model? We're saying none of it's perfect, right? None of it's going to accurately, really give us an idea of how people would behave, but would that be at least be better than any of the other two, either of the other two?
No, I'm going to be blunt and say no. I don't think gaming as a model for what would happen in the real world has any applicability. I think that's a dangerous road to walk down. I think people in the late 90s, early 2000s were arguing that games were getting too violent, and that's why we're seeing a
Mhm.
rise in violent crime in the country, or around the world, I should say. And I didn't like that argument then. I didn't think that because a guy gets to whatever play, I don't know what's an early late 90s game with a gun, Doom. I don't think that made that person like want to go out and do bad things in the real
Mhm.
world. So I don't, again, even though I do play a video game and I do enjoy it, I don't think you can say really a whole lot about me as a human being by what I do in that game and how that might apply to me in the real world. I mean, yes, I can, for example, you just gave us the story of shooting a person just trying to get water at a well an hour or two ago. You did this before we
Mhm.
started recording. I firmly believe that in any scenario that you could be presented in the real world that would never happen, even if it is during
Right.
the apocalypse, right? Well, I don't know, maybe you go crazy, I don't know. But that, so I just don't see it. I just don't see it happening.
Well, and
Me
all of the
I
studies from the early 90s that quote unquote proved correlation between video games and real world violence have been completely debunked, right? Like since then. So
Well, and I just don't see that scenario. And it's not just with video games, it's anything with the online zeitgeist at this point. The way people behave in an online environment is exponentially, it's not the word I'm looking for, it doesn't go up, but regardless, is very different than how they behave in real life. And we see this even as educators. We see this. The interactions we get in our online classes are quite different than the interactions we get in face-to-face classes. I mean, and there are numerous data sets out there that verify this, that a person acts a certain way on TikTok that they would never act in a face-to-face scenario.
100%.
Facebook, when it was still popular, who or Instagram or these types of things, like who in their right mind takes pictures of like their breakfast or their lunch and goes on this long brag session? You would never do this in face to face. Like I mean, at least maybe the people I run with don't like, come up with like, they wouldn't come up in the early 2000s or late 90s with like Polaroid pictures of their breakfast and give it to me. Like, and
Right.
you know what I'm
show
saying?
up at like your friend's house, be like, I brought my breakfast for you to look at.
Yeah, like exactly. So I don't think these interactions, I don't know why. Again, sometimes my examples just kind of come willy-nilly, whatever. But but the behavior people are exhibiting in the online world is always going to be different, whether it's in a video game or whether it's in social media or whatever it is. Like I don't think there's a lot that we can learn in this specific example of what would people do when their world is ending. And again, even in the most apocalyptic games that I'm aware of, I still don't think that's a good indicator. DayZ,
well, like you said, there's no real
Rust,
stakes, right? Like,
I mean, DayZ is number one by far. It's not even close. Sorry if that's controversial for anyone listening, but none of the other games are even remotely close as far as an apocalyptic survival game. They try, they fail. It is the best. I guess Project Zomboid's up there too. Shout out to Project Zomboid. But regardless, like all the other ones, like they're even the best of the best still don't. It's still a game. It's still just a video game. People know that. They go into it. There's no real stakes. It's that simple.
so I've always wanted to. This isn't really related to the apocalyptic theme, but I've always wanted there to be a game. Let's say it costs $40 or $30, $20, whatever it is, like a regular game. That's like a Call of Duty or a DayZ. But when you die, you're done. Your character is done. Your game stops working, and you have to rebuy the game to play again. I've always wanted to see that and see how people would play differently.
It would change behavior. The closest thing we have right now is there is a DayZ server that is a one life server where you can never play that server again. Once you die, it's one life and then you die. So you could try that one, and you can never play that server again. But
the problem is, what would happen is people would definitely be more cautious for sure. But the first dude that gets geared is just going to ruin people's lives, right? Like the first person that's sniping and like.
And it still doesn't say anything that the point of this episode is about human behavior. It still doesn't, because again, you're still in the example I provided. You're still in that same world where all roads lead to some sort of military compound, and people are going to be competing for those specific resources there. And it, yes, and there is no vested stake. So if I happen to see you sneaking around, I don't know, some barracks, and I already have the rifle we were both competing for, this is a video game, and you played a video game, and we probably have decades. I'm assuming all players have a couple of decades of playing these games together, and these games are all shooty to begin with. So I've been socialized to like, this is what I do, right? Like, so again, I just don't think it says. I don't think we can learn a lot, I guess is what I'm saying, which is kind of weird to say after we did the episode on DayZ, but I think we came to the same conclusion then. So
yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you for listening. To our Patreon supporters, thank you so much for your continued support. We apologize for the gap in content. We both had a hectic schedule since the summer has began. We're hoping to start recording a little more often, obviously. Catch me on Twitch. I will be streaming our Botanical Garden Simulator later. Just kidding. I'm Nick.
I'm Jared.
Later.